What a sneaky thief grief is, robbing us of our joyful days. Adelle Purdham. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review on AMI Audio. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Let me read to you a synopsis. With the arrival of her daughter with Down syndrome, Adelle Purdham began unpacking a lifetime of her own ableism. In a society where people with disabilities remain largely invisible, what does it mean to parent such a child? And simultaneously, what does it mean as a mother, a writer, and a woman to truly be seen? The candid essays in I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I Told Myself glimmer with humanity and passion and explore ideas of motherhood, disability, and worth. Purdham delves into grief, rage, injustice, privilege, female friendship, marriage, and desire in a voice that is loudly empathetic, unapologetic, and true. While examining the dichotomies inside of herself, she leaves us to consider the flaws in society, showing us the beauty, resilience, chaos, and wild within us all. This is an essay collection called I Don't Do Disabilities and Other Lies I've Told Myself by Adelle Purdham. Ramya Amuthan is with me. Rams, how's it going?
Hey, so good. I'm very much looking forward to this chat.
It's not just you, though. We also have Adelle Purdham herself here. How's it going, Adelle?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me here.
I don't even know where we should start. So I'm going to ask the most basic question. Why did you write this essay?
Oh, there's so many directions I could go in answering this. But I wrote this collection. I think it goes back to when my middle daughter, Elise, who has Down syndrome, was an infant. And I walked into my local bookstore. And as I had done with other important, events, issues, concerns in my life, I was looking for a memoir or a book written by a mother with Down syndrome. I wanted to get understand the experience of disability parenting through someone else's experience and learn. And I went into the bookstore, and not only was that book not there, but there were no books on Down syndrome. And it made me feel like no one cared. And it felt emblematic of how disability is viewed in our society more broadly as invisible. And so that was one experience. And that's sort of the story. So then, from there, I started writing for newspapers, for magazines, trying to share our story, and became sort of a disability ally in that way and an advocate for my daughter. And that's the sort of version of the story where I maybe look like the good guy, like I wanted to do this good thing, but that's only half the story of why I wrote the book. I think at the heart of this book is me confronting my own ableism as a mother to a daughter with Down syndrome, and the way that came about, or that understanding. I remember when Elise was born, being in the hospital and just holding this adorable baby in my arms, her milky scent, the way her little finger kind of curled around mine. And she was everything that a baby should be. And that was not what I had been expecting. Or rather, up until that point, I had held images in my head about what it means to be disabled. And just those images were contrasting with the beautiful baby in front of me. So when you have that sort of contrast as a writer, that rub, that friction, that tension, it became those emotions that became really something I wanted to explore on the page. And also the secret reason. I always say the secret because I don't feel like if I told everyone I just wanted to share my unconditional love for my daughter, that maybe that no one would maybe be that interested. But that's also my secret, my kind of, the underlying, the underlying is like that feeling of love and wanting to convey that to others.
The self-reflection that comes with the do you call it an epiphany? But, the realization that you don't do disability, that you're confronting your own ableism. You go through that in one part of your collection where you talk about like why is this so hard, right? Like goodness, like being good and doing good for people and volunteering and doing all this stuff that we know are making us feel like we're doing good in the world or being altruistic. But then where does disability sit in that? And you kind of went through this self-reflective situation around a person you knew, Toby, and how that played a role in your realization and what that means for now moving forward. And it was quite interesting because I don't know if a lot of us connect dots this way unless something drastic happens in life, which is exactly what was going on with you, right? You have a daughter with Down syndrome, and now you have to like face all this stuff.
Yeah, and you're talking about the titular essay, the I Don't Do Disability essay. And that was the first essay that I sort of conceived of that was going to be this book idea. And that it also took me the longest to write. But I think that it's just in looking back that we can connect the dots as essayists and bring the memories together that sort of shape who we are. And so for me, Toby was part of it, but also it was that moment of standing, like I can recognize it after my daughter was born, I could recognize it for being important in coming to understand ableism. But it was that moment of, being this 16-year-old competitive gymnast, the pinnacle of my, like really into strength and ability and physical pursuits, right? And anyway, and also wanting to do good and volunteering. And then kind of sitting with myself as a 16-year-old and having this moment in my own head where I said, wait a minute, why are you volunteering with all of these other groups? But why are you avoiding people with intellectual disabilities?
Right.
And I really called myself out. And I very quickly then came to my own rescue, sort of dismissing, 20-25% of the world's population who are disabled, and said, that's okay. I just don't do disability. And it was just the way that I viewed disability at the time, right? That if I distance myself and those that I loved from this idea that I held about what disability meant, that I could somehow keep myself separate, like disability was a separate thing and not just part of the human condition. And so then fast forward 12 years later, my daughter with Down syndrome is born, and that story just can't hold anymore about disability. And it also comes into like this idea of disability being like a bad thing or a good thing. Like there's such the problematic nature of black and white dichotomies, right?
Yeah.
And not allowing for the actual human experience, which is probably mostly gray.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It's just more nuanced than anything. But it's interesting because sorry, Jacob, I know you're going to jump in with something, but I wanted to say we have this show on AMI TV called You Can't Ask That. And essentially people with different types of disabilities will sit around and pick questions out of a hat that somebody has gathered, and all the questions are stuff that you just don't ask.
It's a
you don't
great
ask
show.
people, and it's so good. Seriously, check it out. But anyway, your this part of your collection, so the I Don't Disability essay particularly, explores all that, right? Like it explores like what is it about disability that frightens us? What are the things that we're actually scared of? What am I feeling versus what the stigmas that society have put on us are? Like there's just so many different parts to this essay that reminded me of that show, because we're just thinking, oh gosh, like am I even allowed to voice the things that I'm feeling around this? Because it's so, inappropriate or mean or, whatever it is, alienating for people with disabilities.
You're very introspective in a lot of these essays, and there are 19 of them in this collection. And something you do often is go back to when you were younger. So you say, when I was 10, I did this and that. When I was 12, and then you tell a story of something that happened when you were 12. When I was 25. And one of the main themes is your outlook on disability throughout your life, and how you come to acknowledge your internalized ableism, how you've come to overcome it, really. But there's another theme that I thought was really interesting. And you describe being the mother of a child with Down syndrome as being a sort of all-encompassing identity in and of itself, and how you're initially afraid of it and maybe a little uncomfortable with it and don't know what to make of it. Did you come to accept it? Like, how do you reflect on that now? Do you see it as a good thing, as a bad thing? I'm curious.
How do I just want to clarify, Jacob, like what aspect do you mean? Like can you repeat the last part of that again? Like what?
It's because you describe being the mother of a child with Down syndrome as being an identity in and of itself. Like, how do you reflect on that?
That's so I haven't thought of it like that before because it's so funny. I think of myself, maybe it's maybe that idea of the all encompassing identity. I
Because you do
mean,
have
I,
two other
is in a way.
kids.
I do. I have three
Right.
daughters. And
Yeah.
so I have Elise is my middle daughter. They're 13, 12, and 8 now.
Hmm.
But it's funny because I write about in this collection, I write about different facets of my life almost to create the opposite impression that I am multifaceted, that I am more than just a mother to a daughter with Down
Yeah.
syndrome. Because I think that's a stereotype that if you're a mother to a child, yeah, what would be in the past referred to, a special needs mom, that's all that you are.
A
And
special needs mom. It's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember you bringing up that topic, and you do bring up a woman that was in her 80s that had a child with Down syndrome, and that she was the caretaker for that child until adulthood. And you have some mixed feelings about that too.
I guess I have, yeah, mixed feelings
At the time,
about,
though.
yeah, no, mixed feelings around being judged and how I'll be judged as I feel like mothers are so heavily judged.
Yeah.
There's an Alicia Elliott line from A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, I think, where she writes that mothers are the most hated group in the world. And a professor had said this to her in one of her courses. And I feel like, you know, yeah, there's so many ways that mothers are judged. And so I hope that I push back against that. I hope that I show other parents that you can have a full life. And I also think this idea that my daughter has encompassed me in a way, my identity, I guess the way that manifests itself is I now see the world completely differently.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that role has become encompassing in my life in a way that's irrevocable, but now in the best way, because I used to see myself, I describe it often as kind of sitting on my high horse. It was okay for someone else to have a child with Down syndrome,
Sure.
but not me. And
Even
then,
you pointed that out even in like one of the focus groups, right? Where you were like, but aren't we supposed to be here to make society think better of us, or to treat people with disabilities better? Like you called it righteous in that paragraph, and I thought it was
oh,
quite
yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, this idea of it's this whole like a memoir is like a transformation and a journey, right?
Mm.
So for me, the initial feeling was, I can't both love her and be afraid of being her mom or, being this parent to a child
Right.
with Down syndrome
Yeah.
at the same time. So I'm just going to love her fiercely. But then, I mean, there's other issues that need to be addressed, right? And it takes time to learn. And I think we're afraid of the things that we don't understand. And so I initially had very much this crusader mentality of like, I'm going to fix things, be the martyr. And
Mm-hmm.
I think a great example of that, of my learning, comes later in that essay, the I Don't Do Disability essay. I talk about going to the World Down Syndrome Congress
Mm-hmm.
in 2014 and thinking, I'm going to go there, I'm going to get all this information, I'm going to come back, I'm going to save every last one of those babies with Down syndrome. And, with by bringing back this information. And, and I'm going to have so much to offer parents. And then I went there and another mom pulled me into a room, a session that was happening. at this world conference that happens every 3 years. And, experts with Down syndrome from around the world. And it was my first time. And I get pulled in by this mom, and it's her daughter, Sherry Bernard, who's about to speak. And Sherry was named South Africa's Woman of the Year. Okay, and she's a person with Down syndrome who's my age. And she was named Woman of the Year for becoming the first person with Down syndrome to become a qualified teacher. Anyway, I go in the room. I don't really have any expectations because I didn't know that a person with Down syndrome could advocate for themselves. And Sherry's telling the story of her life, and she's telling a poignant story of the time when her dad died. And then she's telling a story about the boys that used to tease her, and she would threaten to give them her Down syndrome, right? And then we're all laughing because they were like, oh my gosh, right? And, she's showing like the full breadth of human emotion as well, right? And then she starts talking about babies like me are aborted. We deserve to live. And in that moment, and even telling you now, every hair on my arm went up, and the whole room went silent. And we all just sort of took that in. And I realized that in that moment, Sherry Bernard had so much more to teach me than I had to teach her. And that I had went there thinking I'm going to go back and have all this information to share. And I did, but I hadn't been open to the possibility that I would learn the most from people with Down syndrome. And that has continued to be my experience. Listening to people with lived experience is crucial, right? In learning to be an ally and in learning about our own internalized ableism, and maybe also to bring it back to what we were talking about earlier, in learning not to be afraid.
I was curious about Dan's role. Like, of course, reading through the essays, your husband, Dan, you chronicle your relationship and its phases, and then the ups and downs and just everything, just absolutely the spectrum of what you go through together as parents, him as a father, you as a mother. But were there parts that felt more vulnerable than others to write about, in terms of your relationship and everything around that? Or were there things that you discussed with Dan? Like, what was it like writing those parts? Because I think that's a different type of vulnerability, the test of the relationships that parents go through together.
Yeah, well, I think communication is so important in a relationship. And we've had that from the very beginning, thankfully. And I mean, I want to answer your question about vulnerabilities, but I think it's important to say that when Dan and I had been dating for 2 weeks, we had this conversation because I like to talk about everything.
Yeah.
Hey, what about if I got pregnant? What about, okay, yes, he said, I would take care of you. Okay, what about if the baby had special needs? The term at the time again. And he sort of paused, and I knew how I felt, and then said, well, it would be our baby, right? Yeah, right, I said. And then fast forward to that moment in the high-risk obstetrician's office, many years later when we received the diagnosis that our daughter was going to be born with Down syndrome. And I remember just like, okay, is he going to feel the same way? And thankfully he did, because now it's real, right? And I knew, I could feel, I'd given birth to one daughter already, and this next baby who had Down syndrome, like, she felt the same, right, inside me. And my feelings about her, I loved her, and all of these things, right? And so thankfully we were on the same page. But I think it's important, I wanted to give that context because it's important to understand Dan and I have always been on the same page. That isn't the case for other parents, that necessarily. And so I've been super lucky to have a very supportive partner who has also experienced, I feel like as the one who was home for 9 years, sort of raising my daughters, I was sort of at the front lines of experiencing a lot of the subtle ways that people with disabilities are excluded or devalued. I feel like I felt it most. He was often off at work, right? But he listened to me. And so he understood the immense value of sharing our stories, and also like that those stories were still absent from the shelf. Like there are memoirs written out of the US by mothers, but there are very few books written in Canada. So he was my first reader and listener. I would read as part of my editing process. I would I've been fortunate to have many editors as part of the MFA program at the University of King's College. You work with mentors, and I wrote the majority of this book during that 2-year master's degree, where I got to work with some phenomenal writers: Jane Silcock, Cooper Lee Bombardier, Ayelet Sabari. But then there was Dan, right? The professional mentors, and then there was my husband, and that was part of the process for me, reading out loud, and also because a lot of them are our stories between us, but even more so to make sure to protect our daughter with Down syndrome and our children, right? To make sure I wanted that accountability, and I wanted someone else who I trusted, you know, to be able to bounce ideas off. How does this feel to you? Are you okay with this? But as a memoirist, once you've dealt with your stories, like I would say to anyone out there, if you're an aspiring writer and have these types of very personal stories, you almost need to handle them. And by handle them, I mean think about them, revise them, have others read them many, many times before they're ever out there for public consumption. Many of the essays in my books, for example, were finalists in literary contests. So I knew, they're resonating with readers, and before I ever got to the point where it's a published collection.
Why is that? Is it because it's locked in once it's out, but it's also so personal, so you have to know that it's done? Because we've talked about this before. Like Jacob and I have went on and on about premature memoirs and celebrity memoirs, where we're just like, you're too young. Your story's not finished yet. What do you mean this is your memoir? Like that kind of reaction, because it doesn't feel done or polished or sometimes edited. Yeah. But anyway.
Oh gosh. Yeah. Memoirs are absolutely crafted. And I think it helped me that I had written another book, a complete memoir first, that was more my journey with, receiving the prenatal diagnosis. I wrote that 7 years ago, and it remains unpublished, right? But so many of those ideas were able to be refined and tightened and condensed and rolled into this book that is published. I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I've Told Myself. And that was absolutely helpful. I had a few writer friends, very trusted, who actually my friend, I really want to read your memoir, please. And then I'm going to read your next book. And she said, oh, wow, okay, I can see what you did there, and it's better, condensed. It didn't need to be so expanded upon. And it's intuition, but I think it's just training ourselves as writers to be able to write in a really concise and sharp way and only put what needs to be in the story in there.
So in writing a book that's so personal, you want it to be as much a reflection of your inner reflections, right? And when you pass that on to your writer friends, to your editors, did you ever at any point feel that was making it less you? This is, I know, something that a lot of authors have issues with, is getting their work tampered with. You can say refined, but there's a different perspective from everyone, right?
I absolutely loved and valued the feedback of every person that I got to work with. But it doesn't mean that when you get that feedback, you necessarily have to take all of it. Probably the person who had the most intimate role in deciding if something actually got shaped or not was Megan Beadle, my acquisition editor at Dundurn, who did my substantive or developmental edit. And she's the one who probably had the most power to be like, okay, this needs to change. But thankfully, by the time I had a complete manuscript when I received my publishing deal. And so by the time I got the book there, really it was, a 10-year process of thinking through these ideas, of working on them with other writers who are professionals, editors. And so it was pretty ready to go. But there were a few scenes, like I think only two scenes she wanted me to add. And one was a fight scene between Dan and I. I'm like, you're an asshole. I had to put that, and I'm crouched in the shower. And she needed me to expand on that. And so that was hard to do, in a sense, because again, like so honest and vulnerable to invite an audience into a marital fight. But she said, your readers will thank you. And I always use this guideline of, will this help someone? And would it be really helpful if I'm not about my experiences, for example, with disability parenting, if I don't tell 100% of the truth, right? I really despise this idea that people with Down syndrome are always happy-go-lucky. I think it really does a disservice to who my daughter is, which, she experiences the full breadth of emotion. And so it was important to me that any character in the book, they are characters, right? They're real people, but that everyone was sort of reflected in all of their complexity. And so that meant writing some difficult subject matter.
Very.
At times, and very personal, but I don't think I could have written it any other way.
And even the advocacy side of things. I mean, there are, pockets of just like very informative, this is what Down syndrome is. These are the odds. This is like person first or identity first language preferences for people with disabilities. There are a lot of that kind of advocacy tidbit learnings or information, if you will, that appear in these essays, and that's up for questioning or reacting and responding from the public as well, right? Like there's just so much in here, and I think that the writing is very, very beautiful and honest, like you said, comes across so raw, but also the subject is messy. It's definitely a spectrum, like we get the roller coaster of it, and it's a wonderful read. I can't wait for it to be available in audio, so please keep us posted.
I absolutely will. Thank you.
I think that's all the time we have, guys. But thank you so much, Adelle, for coming on and telling us about your book. How can people get their hands on it?
You can buy this book wherever books are sold. I always encourage to go to your favorite local bookstore, check out the indie bookstores. They really support authors by hosting events, but Chapters, Amazon, all the usual.
And again, the book is called I Don't Do Disability and Other Lies I Tell Myself. Sorry. Ramya, thank you so much. Adelle, have a good one.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
That's all the time we have for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. You can find a repeat of AMI Audiobook Review on Saturdays and Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern, and that repeats every 6 hours. You can also find it wherever you listen to podcasts. Just look up AMI Audiobook Review, and that includes YouTube. So if you make your way to the YouTube page, make sure to like and subscribe. That's all the time we have. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Have a good one.